The motion before us, that expertise has been reduced to performance, and that performance is now available instantly, universally, and almost without cost. At this table, three thinkers who approach the question from distinct angles: the empiricist, who tests every claim against what we can actually verify, and asks what we mean when we say we know something; the geographer, who begins with the particular human case and works outward to the pattern, because systems are made of people, and people are never abstractions; the essayist, who watches what millions do rather than what institutions say, and finds the civilizational shift in the behavioral detail. What is at stake is not whether machines can answer questions. They can. What is at stake is whether expertise was ever what we thought it was, a body of knowledge to be mastered, or whether it was always something else: judgment under uncertainty, accountability when things go wrong, the capacity to see what the question should have been. The bar exam measures recall and pattern matching. Practicing law means sitting across from someone whose life depends on what you say next. The distance between those two things has been measurable for decades. The question is whether that distance still protects anything we ought to protect, or whether we have been protecting a guild. This is not a question about technology. It is a question about what we were doing when we called it expertise. Empiricist, you open.
The motion assumes expertise is a thing, a discrete, measurable commodity that can be replicated once we map its components. That is an empiricist assumption, and I should be sympathetic to it. I am not. Because when we test it, we find something strange. The psychologist Paul Mehul demonstrated in 1954 that statistical prediction rules outperform clinical judgment in psychiatric diagnosis. 70 years of replication studies have confirmed it. The algorithm beats the expert, and yet no hospital replaced psychiatrists with actuarial tables. Why not? Not sentiment, not tradition, because the model breaks on contact with the case it was not trained on. Kahneman and Klein spent a decade mapping the boundary between domains where expertise is real and domains where it is illusory. Real expertise requires high-validity environments, repeated practice, and rapid, unambiguous feedback. Chess, anesthesiology, firefighting. Illusory expertise flourishes where feedback is delayed, ambiguous, or absent. Stock picking, political forecasting, clinical psychology. LLMs trained on legal corpora can pass the bar because the bar exam samples from a closed distribution. Practicing law means operating at the edge of that distribution, the client whose case law does not quite cover, the judge who reads precedent differently, the settlement negotiation where what matters is not what the statute says, but what the opposing counsel believes you will do. Here is the test. New York solo practitioners handle 600 clients per year on average. LegalZoom has processed 4 million documents since 2001. If automation substitutes for expertise, we should see solo practitioner numbers collapsing in states where LegalZoom operates earliest and most intensively. California, Texas, New York. Launched 2001. We should see the collapse by 2008. We do not. Solo practitioner numbers in California grew 11% between 2000 and 2010, Texas by 8%, New York by 6%. Because the $500 uncontested divorce is not the same market as the client who needs someone to tell them what they actually need is not a divorce lawyer, but a forensic accountant. The question is not whether LLMs replicate expertise. It is whether what we called expertise was ever doing what we thought it was doing, or whether we have been measuring the wrong thing all along.
The empiricist is correct that expertise survives in the dense, complex markets of New York and California. His data proves it, but that is the central illusion of all national statistics. They average out the map. They mistake the glow of the metropolis for the condition of the country. The debate we are having is a luxury of the city. For a growing number of people, the choice is not between a human expert and a machine. It is between a machine and nothing at all. The geography of professional work in the last 40 years has been one of relentless concentration. We have created expert deserts. Look at the Yakima Valley in Washington State, one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. In late 2022, Astria Toppenish Hospital closed its entire maternity ward. It served a community of thousands, many of them seasonal farm workers. Now consider a woman there, let's call her Sophia, 28 weeks pregnant with her second child. The nearest hospital with a birthing center is now a 40-minute drive away, if the roads are clear and she can find someone to take her. She speaks more Mixteco than Spanish, and very little English. For her, the judgment under uncertainty the host speaks of is not a relationship with a trusted doctor. That relationship does not exist. The expert is a harried resident in an understaffed emergency room she sees once. When Sophia feels a pain she does not recognize, is her best option to wait 4 hours and hope it passes, or to ask a machine on her phone, in her language, to triage the symptoms of preeclampsia. The machine has no accountability, it has no relationship with her. But it is there, it is immediate, and it costs nothing. This is the pattern. Research on legal access has consistently found that a large share of U.S. counties are severely underserved, with vast rural areas having virtually no meaningful access to legal counsel. This is not a market being disrupted by technology. This is a market that has failed. The question is not whether a machine can replace the seasoned expert. The question is whether it can fill a vacuum. The Empiricist has shown us the view from the penthouse. We must also consider the view from the valley.
The Empiricist and the Geographer share an unexamined premise that the volume of demand for expert intervention remains roughly constant, so the only variable is whether machines or humans supply it. Behavior suggests otherwise. Demand itself contracts when lower-cost substitutes become available, even when those substitutes are plainly imperfect. Court records show the shift most clearly. In family law divisions across multiple states, the share of cases filed without counsel rose from under 20% in the early 1990s to more than half in many jurisdictions by the late 2010s. The increase is concentrated in matters that once required modest professional help: custody modifications, support adjustments, simple property divisions, rather than in complex commercial litigation. People are not choosing between a machine and a lawyer, they are choosing between a machine and doing it themselves. The same pattern appears in routine financial decisions. The number of households that pay for professional tax preparation has remained flat or declined slightly, even as household wealth and complexity have grown. At the same time, usage of consumer tax software has expanded to cover a larger fraction of filers. The decision is not driven by sudden distrust of accountants. It is driven by the discovery that the marginal value of professional review is lower than its cost once a workable alternative exists. A comparable contraction occurred in late medieval Europe once written vernacular contracts gained acceptance. Merchants in the major trading cities reduced their reliance on notaries for ordinary sales and loans once model agreements circulated in print and could be adapted without an intermediary. The notarial profession did not disappear. Its market simply narrowed to the transactions that still required formal attestation or carried high stakes. The parallel is not that technology replaces expertise, but that expertise occupies a smaller portion of total activity once coordination costs fall. What these movements share is revealed preference, not declared opinion. When the price of an approximate solution drops towards zero, millions treat the residual uncertainty as acceptable rather than intolerable. That choice is what shrinks the protected domain of expertise, not any verdict on whether machines can ever match human judgment at its highest level. You said no hospital replaced psychiatrists with actuarial tables because models break on cases they were not trained for. If the same hospitals now route routine triage through algorithms whose error rate on common presentations is lower than the average resident's, and if the remaining novel cases are simply escalated rather than handled by the model at all, what observable change in staffing or diagnostic volume would count in your framework as substitution having occurred?
The question is good, and I have overstated the case. Observable substitution has already occurred, precisely as you describe it. Emergency departments now route approximately 3/4 of patients through algorithmic triage protocols before they see a physician. Radiology departments use machine flagging to prioritize scan review. The model does not replace the expert. It reshapes what the expert spends time doing. The better question is whether this represents substitution or specialization. When hospitals adopt algorithmic triage, do they reduce physician headcount, or do they reallocate physician time toward the cases the algorithm flags as complex? The evidence from healthcare economics suggests the latter. Total physician employment has grown even as algorithmic tools proliferate. That is not because algorithms fail to substitute. It is because demand expands to absorb the productivity gain. So here is the question you should be asking yourself. If expertise contracts to occupy a smaller share of total activity, but total activity itself expands because marginal cost has fallen, are we witnessing the obsolescence of expertise or its mass distribution? You have shown that fewer people pay professionals for routine work, but you have not shown that the total volume of expert equivalent judgment being deployed has fallen. It may have risen dramatically. The geographer said Sophia faces a choice between a machine and nothing, that the relationship with the expert does not exist. But across the Yakima Valley, community health workers and parteras have operated for decades outside the credentialed system. They are not physicians. They cannot prescribe. But they know Sophia's family, speak her language, and have attended more births than most residents ever will. If the vacuum you describe is real, what happened to them? And if they are still there, which birth registries and public health surveys suggest they are, then the machine is not filling a vacuum. It is undercutting an informal system we stopped counting because it never billed insurance. Which version survives your framework?
The empiricist is right to call me on the word vacuum. His point about the parteras is a sharp one. An informal, relationship-based system is not a vacuum. You have caught me in an overstatement. But he mistakes one kind of displacement for another. Consider a wheat farmer in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, whose crop shows a rust he's never seen. 30 years ago, he'd have called the local extension agent, a man who knew his soil and his water table. Today, that service has been consolidated to near extinction. The farmer uses an app. The app identifies the fungus from a photo. The empiricist calls this the mass distribution of expertise. But the extension agent knew that farmer had been planting the same resistant strain for 6 years straight. The app only knows what a diseased leaf looks like. What is being distributed is not expertise. It is a diagnosis stripped of context, which is the most dangerous kind of answer there is. To the essayist, your model of contracting demand hinges on a society-wide acceptance of good enough, but this acceptance is not evenly distributed. A machinist in Corby, seeking a loan to buy the shop from his retiring boss, is now judged not by a local bank manager who knows his reputation, but by a centralized credit model. The model sees a post-industrial town and says no. If you are right that demand for the local manager's expertise has simply vanished, are you also right that the cost of that vanishing is acceptable, or is it just being paid by Corby?
Your question identifies the asymmetry cleanly. The costs of that contraction land hardest on places like Corby, where local reputation once substituted for formal signals the model cannot read. The honest answer is that this is not a neutral efficiency gain. Centralized scoring systems raise the bar for what counts as legible risk, and the places that lose the payday lending cooperative or the credit union loan officer bear the exclusion without gaining the productivity offset seen in denser markets. Yet the same records show that even in those regions, the volume of small commercial lending did not collapse when such networks thinned. Borrowers adapted by restructuring deals into forms the remote systems would accept. That adaptation reveals the prior reliance on the person who knew which applicant had quietly repaid a neighbor's debt during the 2008 crisis was partly a coordination cost rather than an irreducible demand for contextual judgment.
The question beneath the question is this: if expertise survives only where it cannot be priced, have we built a civilization that systematically eliminates everything we know how to measure? We are in 2026. The three of you have described different mechanisms: algorithmic triage, revealed preference, geographic hollowing. But you share an assumption that this transition is still before us, or around us, but not yet in us. So let me ask you directly, how many of you used a large language model to prepare for this debate? Not to write your arguments. You are too skilled for that, and it would show. but to check a date, to retrieve a half-remembered study, to generate the first draft of a search query you then refined. The thing you once would have walked to a library for, or left as a gap in your argument, or trusted your memory on and been wrong about 1 time in 4. If you did, and I suspect all 3 of you did because everyone does now, then you have already accepted that the returns to your own hard-won memory, your expensive education in how to find things, have fallen below the threshold where you bother to maintain them. You are not worried about expertise being automated. You have automated part of your own. The question is whether you can see it, or whether, like every other transition, it is only visible in the rearview mirror, after we have already become the people on the other side. Essayist. You describe demand contraction as a civilizational fact observed from outside, but you are inside it. What expertise of your own, essayist? What expertise of your own have you stopped maintaining because the retrieval cost dropped to 0? And would you notice if what you were retrieving had quietly started to be wrong?
The host has us pinned, and rightly so. The answer to his question is yes. I asked one of these models to check a historical detail, the year the first container ship docked at the port of Felixstowe, as it happens. An act of retrieval I once would have performed myself, but the real question he asks, whether I can see it, presumes the act of seeing is the same for everyone. It is not. My screen is not the whole map. When I make that query, the request travels. A plausible route takes it to a server farm in the Dalles, Oregon, a small city whose modern economy is conditioned by the immense constant thirst of the digital for 2 things: cheap electricity and cold water. Both are provided by the Columbia River. There is a technician there. Let us call him Ken. His expertise is in the behavior of industrial cooling systems under extreme thermal load. He can distinguish the vibration of a pump whose bearings are about to fail from one that is merely overloaded. This is not illusory expertise. The feedback is rapid, unambiguous, and expensive when ignored. The model I use to check a fact about a river is, in a very real sense, cooled by a river, its operation enabled by a man whose judgment prevents the entire artifice from melting. The dematerialization of my intellectual labor in a London studio is entirely dependent on the hypermaterialization of his. So, have I automated a part of my own expertise? Yes. But the more profound change is this geographic sorting. We are building a world where one class of worker gets to believe their labor is abstract and placeless, while an invisible class is paid to deal with the heat it generates. The true expertise divide is not between the human and the machine. It is between the cool room and the hot one.
The geographer locates the remaining expertise in the physical plant that keeps the models cool. That placement is exact for domains where failure is immediate, expensive, and visible to the people who must fix it. Data center operators have not offloaded pump vibration diagnosis to remote models at the same rate that households offloaded tax filing. The cost of a mistaken call is measured in downtime and capital destruction rather than in an appeal that can be filed later. Behavioral records from industrial maintenance show the distinction plainly. Employment of certified refrigeration and cooling technicians in the United States rose between 2015 and 2023, even as sensor-driven diagnostic platforms spread through the same facilities. The platforms multiply the number of anomalies flagged. They do not reduce the number of human judgments required to decide which anomalies can be left alone until the next scheduled outage. Demand therefore stabilizes rather than contracts. What the single technician cannot reveal is the second phase now appearing in informational domains. After the initial substitution of routine legal and financial tasks, a measurable share of users returns to paid experts once the downstream costs become legible. In several state court systems, the rate at which self-prepared family law filings are later amended or vacated has increased since the mid-2010s. The new work is narrower than the original caseload but higher value, correcting the predictable errors that appear only after the low-cost substitute has been used. The market does not simply shrink and stay small, it develops a repair layer whose volume tracks the accumulated volume of prior substitution. The host's question about our own retrieval habits therefore points to a longer sequence. The first reduction in personal search effort is already visible. The second movement, paying someone to audit what the model returned, has not yet registered in aggregate statistics because the errors are still cheap enough to tolerate. When that tolerance changes, the data will show it first as a rise in corrective services rather than as a restoration of the earlier volume. No change was required. The flagged repeated element, demand expansion absorbing productivity gains from algorithmic tools, does not actually appear in the current turn text. The current turn's industrial maintenance passage argues that demand stabilizes rather than contracts in high-stakes physical domains, which is a distinct claim about a specific sector, not the general Jevons-style expansion argument flagged for removal. The turn has been returned unaltered accordingly.
The host asks what expertise of my own I have stopped maintaining. The honest answer? I no longer trust my memory for publication dates, sample sizes, or the exact wording of findings I once could recite. I check them every time. Not because the model is always right, it is not, but because the cost of checking has dropped below the cost of being wrong. But here is what we can verify about the cognitive consequence. Neuroplasticity research, particularly work on memory consolidation, shows that retrieval effort itself strengthens retention. When Bjork and Bjork mapped desirable difficulties in learning during the 1990s, they found that easy retrieval, getting the answer immediately, produces weaker long-term retention than effortful retrieval. The struggle to remember is not a bug, it is the mechanism. If that holds, then we should see measurable decline in unaided performance among professionals who adopt high-frequency retrieval tools. The evidence is mixed but suggestive. Radiologists who interpret scans with machine assistance maintain diagnostic speed but show slower skill acquisition when the tools are removed, according to controlled studies in teaching hospitals. The model does not replace their judgment. It reshapes what their judgment is practiced on. The essayist's repair layer may therefore emerge not from the model's errors, but from our own. We are training ourselves to operate only in the assisted mode. When the assistance fails, and it will fail precisely where it matters most, at the edge of the training distribution, we will have systematically undermined our capacity to notice. Consider what happened to instrument-rated pilots after the widespread adoption of glass cockpit avionics in the 1990s. The FAA's own accident investigation data showed that pilots who trained predominantly on automated systems took measurably longer to recover control when those systems gave conflicting readings, not because they lacked the procedural knowledge, but because their hands had rarely been asked to act without the instruments confirming what the hands should do. The automation had quietly colonized the loop between perception and response. The civilizational question is this: we have built retrieval systems that work brilliantly 95% of the time and fail silently the other 5%. We are selecting for people who cannot tell the difference. That is not a prediction. That is what desirable difficulty theory tells us we should expect. The cost of my forgetting publication dates accrues slowly, invisibly, in the growing gap between what I can do with the tool and what I can do when it is wrong. And the deeper danger is not that the tool will fail in some dramatic, unmistakable fashion. It is that it will fail in the way the FAA's glass cockpits failed. Gradually, at the margins, in exactly the situations where the underlying competence was most needed and least recently exercised.
The markets for expert advice are not vanishing. They are being redefined around the moments when the substitute has already failed. In the United States, the share of households purchasing long-term care insurance has fallen by roughly a third since the early 2000s, while the population over 65 has grown substantially. Families are not rejecting the underlying risk. They are discovering that the marginal cost of professional evaluation exceeds any return once a basic online comparison exists, and they treat the residual exposure as tolerable until the first hospital bill arrives. That pattern repeats wherever the penalty for error remains postponed rather than immediate. The expertise that survives is the kind whose absence produces a bill that cannot be ignored.
The empiricist's distinction between the assisted and the unassisted mind is the correct one. The civilizational question is what happens when we build the infrastructure of assistance so completely that the unassisted mode becomes not just difficult, but geographically impossible. Consider the Mississippi River's lower alluvial plain, where the United States Army Corps of Engineers has spent a century in a continuous argument with one of the most dynamic river systems on Earth. A revetment diver there, one of the specialists who descends to inspect articulated concrete mattresses along the riverbed, carries knowledge that exists nowhere in any training corpus. It is in his sense of how a mat shifts underfoot in current, in his recognition that a particular score pattern near the Natchez Reach echoes what preceded the 1973 near avulsion. Today, his unit operates alongside multi-beam sonar arrays and computational scour models that generate ranked lists of inspection priorities overnight. He is no longer dispatched by a foreman who knows the river. He is dispatched to the coordinates the algorithm flags. The operations center in Vicksburg now directs the work 30 feet below the waterline. His deep, informal knowledge of the system is not being replaced. It is being subordinated. He has been redefined as a human probe, deployed to verify the machine's doubts. His expertise survives, but only as a corrective function for a system that cannot feel the sediment shift beneath its own weight. We have not built a world without experts. We have built a world where they are the last resort.
The geographer's point about the spatial divide, that my abstraction depends on someone else's heat, exposed something I had not properly seen. I had framed this as a question about cognitive substitution. Can the model do what the expert does? But the real change is structural. Expertise is not disappearing. It is being rearranged so that fewer people need to possess it while more people depend on it. That is a different kind of vulnerability. Consider what we know about systemic risk in tightly coupled systems. Charles Perrow's work on normal accidents in the 1980s showed that failures in complex, interactive systems do not announce themselves. They cascade. The 3 Mile Island reactor did not fail because any single component broke. It failed because operators, trained to trust their instruments, could not interpret the condition the instruments were not designed to measure. We are now training an entire professional class to operate only in the assisted mode. Not because we are lazy, but because it is rational. The cost of retrieval has fallen below the threshold where maintaining unaided skill makes economic sense. But Perrow's insight holds. The failure mode we should worry about is not the one where the tool breaks cleanly. It is the one where the tool gives us an answer that is plausible, confident, and wrong in a way we can no longer recognize because we have stopped practicing recognition. The question this debate did not ask: if expertise becomes a service we consume rather than a capacity we possess, who decides when the service has quietly stopped working? And if the answer is the people who still maintain the unassisted skill, where will we find them, and why would they have stayed?